guys are listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast, and I'm here with my friend Lee Gatiss. This is going to be a very exciting crossover episode between my podcast and Lee's podcast. So for those who don't yet know Lee, can you give us 2 minutes or even 1.5 minutes on who you are and what your podcast is about?
Well, I'm the director of Church Society. I live in Cambridge in England, and our podcast does a whole range of things, but we have these interviews with the authors of the Hodder Bible commentaries as part of our podcast, but we also talk about the Church of England. We have Anglican heroes. We have Heresy Half Hour every so often, where we examine an ancient heresy of some kind or a modern one and talk about that and the answers to it. We're not promoting heresy. We're trying to think about how to answer it and all sorts of Church of England politics and practical things and that sort of thing.
Should I be offended, Lee, that you haven't invited me on Heresy Half Hour, or should it be is it a compliment because you only invite heretics?
Well, this could be a Heresy Half Hour if you don't say the right things about Colossians and Philemon, which is what I'm hoping.
So true, so true.
We'll have to see. I'll give it a mark out of 10 by the end.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that. So for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to kind of hand the reins over to Lee. I'm usually rather a rein holder on this podcast, but I quite enjoy sometimes being able to hand the reins over to somebody else. So I'm going to make the dangerous move of handing the reins over to Lee now and see what happens.
You're not too much of a control freak. That's good to know.
Nah, we'll see.
Well, hello and welcome to the Church Society podcast. I'm Lee Gatiss, the director of Church Society, and I'm also the series editor of the Hodder Bible Commentary. And this podcast is part of a series of interviews with the authors of the Hodder Bible Commentaries about their work, which aims to be globally sensitive and doctrinally aware. And I'm joined today by Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin, the author of several excellent books, including Confronting Christianity, Jesus Through the Eyes of Women, and Does the Bible Affirm Same-Sex Relationships? Welcome, Rebecca.
Hi, Lee. I love how much you sound like a sports sort of announcer in the intro.
Excellent. I think that's probably a good thing, is it? Keep people interested anyway.
We'll roll with that.
Well, you've written, Rebecca, the Hodder Bible Commentary on Colossians and Philemon, two of the Apostle Paul's letters. This is your first commentary on the Bible, I think. So what drew you to take on this project?
Do you know, well, as you and I both know, Lee, it was a Facebook message conversation that drew me to write a commentary on these things. So Lee, when was it? Maybe three years ago, even 4 years ago? Some years past. Long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Lee messaged me via Facebook. You know, this is where all good book projects start.
Oh, yes.
And said, I'm editing this series. Would you be interested in writing a commentary on Ecclesiastes? And as I recall, I'm one of those Christians who actually isn't drawn to the book of Ecclesiastes. Not that I don't, I mean, it's for sure God's word. I'm happy to learn from it. But, you know, I have friends who are like, Ecclesiastes is my favorite book in the Bible. Maybe I'm too chipper for Ecclesiastes to be my favorite book. I don't know. But when Lee said, would you like to write a commentary on Ecclesiastes? I thought, no, not really. But
and that was the end of that.
Well, I said, what else do you have on offer? He said, what are you looking for? It was very kind of cloak and dagger, back of the parking lot, as they say in America, negotiations. And I said, Philemon. And you said it's bundled with Colossians. And I said, deal. I mean, that's basically what
There you go.
So yeah, it's a project that I was excited to undertake, actually, because I'm increasingly interested in what the Bible has to say regarding slavery. And both Philemon and Colossians are New Testament epistles or letters that engage with that topic. And I actually think that as Christians, we have a much stronger case when it comes to the Bible and slavery than we realize that we do. So I was excited to spend time, particularly from that angle, looking at these two amazing first century letters.
And you love the book about the Bible, whichever bit I asked you to do, surely.
Yes, I mean, for sure. If I'd done a commentary on Ecclesiastes, I would have learnt so much. I don't know that my readers would have learnt as much.
Well, we do now have an excellent commentary, Hodder Bible commentary on Ecclesiastes, and you can listen to the podcast all about that with Eric Ortland. So
amazing.
Turns out there was
a much better job.
Yes, it was an excellent commentary, very moving. But in this beautifully produced 200-page hardback commentary on Colossians and Philemon, which is out in July 2026, in all good bookshops and on Kindle as well, you've unpacked Colossians and Philemon for us. Did you have a particular audience or reader in your mind as you were writing this, Rebecca?
When I reach for a commentary myself, I mostly want to read things that that aren't sort of obvious from the text. And it sounds like a strange thing to say because, of course, writing a commentary, I don't want to say things that depart from the text. But I particularly want to have some questions answered that either aren't sort of evident from the text or that are the kinds of questions that friends of mine who maybe not Christians or who are Christians but sort of really struggling with some elements of scripture, the kinds of questions that are coming to mind for them. And so I suppose I wrote this commentary with those folks in mind. So whether that's you yourself or whether perhaps you're a pastor or somebody involved in teaching the Bible one way or another in Bible study context or in personal conversations with people, my hope was to equip readers to have those sorts of conversations. So whether it's about men and women or marriage or slavery or who Jesus is and quite what radical claims the Christian message is making. I wanted to lead into those sorts of questions.
Yeah. And you were thinking about people all over the world, not just white, Western, middle-class people when you were doing this?
Yes, I was actually really, really thankful to be able to draw on some scholarship from people from different parts of the world and to get some eyes, in part thanks to you, eyes on the manuscript from people who are living in very different kind of cultural contexts than I am, as somebody who's always lived either in England or in America. In fact, listeners may be aware that I used to live in Cambridge, UK, and I now live in Cambridge, MA. So, it's a different continent, but also as close to Cambridge in England as you can be while still being in America. So I'm aware that I have a very, as we all do, one way or another, we have quite sort of specific cultural context we're writing to. And I think one of the really illuminating things about studying the scriptures alongside people who come from very different places, which actually I'm privileged to do in our Bible study group that meets actually tonight. We're recording this on a Tuesday, and Tuesday evenings in my house. People who grew up in completely different cultural context. We have members who grew up in India and Iran and Turkey and China, and just who come with very different backgrounds and can bring insights from their different cultural backgrounds that can sometimes help. It's easy if you only read the Bible alongside people who had the exact same sort of upbringing as you do or cultural context as you do. It's easy to assume some things and miss other things.
Yeah.
Which if you're talking with somebody who has actually quite a different kind of lens that they're coming with, they might help you notice things you hadn't noticed or assumptions that you're bringing to the text that actually may not have been there in the first place.
Yeah.
I think there's something really constructive about that.
Yeah, and as the series editor of this series of Bible commentaries, I've insisted that all of the commentators have to read global scholarship. They've got to read commentaries or books by people in Africa or Asia or South America if they're not from there. So, that's been a really good feature, I think, is learning from the global church together. Well, look, let's start with Colossians. Colossians contains some very well-known passages like chapter 3, for example, where Paul calls believers to set their minds on things above. But is there something that you would say is the overarching theme of the letter, the sort of melodic line that runs through the whole thing?
So I'm going to answer this with a weird and rather British analogy, which I use in the introduction to the commentary. So the UK equivalent of Star Wars is Doctor Who, sort of very long-running British sci-fi series, which honestly in recent... I've kind of given up watching it because I think it's actually gone meaningfully downhill. But be that as it may, at the centre of that series is this sort of Time Lord guy who looks human but is in fact alien, and he travels around in a thing called a TARDIS, which stands for time and relative dimension in space. And it looks like an old-fashioned police call box, i.e., back in the days before mobile phones, you could kind of go into one of these call boxes in the street and call the police if you were in a crisis. And one of the features of this TARDIS is that it's bigger on the inside. So every time the Doctor invites somebody kind of into his TARDIS, they first have to adjust to the reality that this, what looks like a box that could fit about one human in it, is in fact so massive that even the Doctor, who's lived in it for thousands of years, hasn't plumbed its depths, like doesn't know all of its secrets, hasn't kind of explored it fully by any means. And I think one of the central claims of Colossians is that this first century Jewish man known as Jesus of Nazareth to his contemporaries is in fact the creator God of all the universe.
Wow.
And that not only is this extraordinary creator God of all the universe sort of crammed into what feels like a police call box in terms of the dimensions of his humanness, is also the same human being who died on a cross, which as 21st century folks who've been influenced by Christianity for 2,000 years, we actually can't even wrap our minds around how shocking that is, because crucifixion was the most humiliating, excruciating death imaginable, designed by the Romans to kind of prove that it was mostly a death allotted to slaves.
Yeah.
To prove their utter subjugation. And at the center of Colossians is the claim that this creator God, which is very clear, especially in Colossians chapter 1, that Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation, and that everything was created through him, and he rules over all things. That this same God is the one who died on a cross to bring redemption to his people, and so it just this absolutely mind-boggling reality of who Jesus is, and how if we've trusted in Jesus, we are in Christ. And that's a little bit like sort of being inside the TARDIS, that where Jesus goes, we go, that we sort of travel in time and space. And there's this extraordinary claim at the beginning of Colossians 3 that we have been raised with Christ, and that we are now sort of spiritually speaking, if we're followers of Jesus, we are where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And this incredible verse, when Christ, who is your life, appears, you also will appear with him in glory. So there's this tension in Colossians between our lived experience now and all the suffering and struggles with sin and limitations that we experience in our day to day. The link between that and the future reality that is coming when Jesus returns, that is already at a deep sense true of us. That we, Paul says, you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. Like it's impossible to wrap your minds around it, but it's central to what Colossians is communicating to us. Sorry, that was a much too long answer to your question.
Well, it's wonderful. In him, all the fullness of the deity dwells bodily. I mean, everything is in Jesus. It's like a TARDIS. I like that. It's very good. What would you say are some of the major themes in the letter as it develops and in the structure of the letter? What kind of things are we going to expect as we read Colossians or your commentary on it?
Yeah, so one of the ways that the letter works is that Paul explains, who Jesus is and who we are in him, and then also cashes that out in terms of what does this mean for your and my life? And one of the primary things it means actually is that we need to stay put. So there's this sort of a moment where one of the main concerns that Paul has for the Colossians is that they could be tempted to sort of move on from Jesus or start adding things to the gospel and sort of uprooting themselves actually from Jesus. And Paul is saying, you need to stay exactly where you are. It's a bit like the sort of famous, probably fabled story of William Tell shooting the apple off his son's head, that, the son's job is to stand absolutely still while his extraordinarily talented archer father shoots the arrow, and that if he stays still, he's safe. But if he moves, he is not safe at all. And that's one of the kind of messages of Colossians, is that we need to stay safe in our conquering King. And then there are implications for what does it mean to live with Jesus as our Lord? And so that's where sort of the famous kind of household code or the set of instructions for people who are living in different circumstances in Colossians 3-4, sort of what flows out from that. So it's a deeply theological and spiritual and very practical book.
Yes, it has that practical bit at the end as well. So it's all kind of rooted in reality as well as some spiritual realities that we can't necessarily see. And I think Colossians deals with some cultural pressures that the Christians were experiencing, tempting them to turn away from Jesus. Are there particular parallels that you see with the pressures facing the church today, particularly perhaps with the issue of identity and whether Christ is sufficient for us or not?
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental places where the gospel sort of clashes with the messaging around us, at least in 21st century Western culture, is that we are told to believe, and I see this as my kids are going to schools in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're in what Americans call public schools and Brits call state schools, sort of government funded free education for the masses, as it were. That's what my kids are in. And one of the messages they will hear consistently is, you are enough, you are wonderful, you are great, everything, like almost everything.
You're worth it.
Yeah, and everything down to the depths of you is good. If you find a desire or a thought or a feeling inside your heart, then it must be good because you are fundamentally good. And if there's anything that seems like maybe it's not good, then it's probably because of the culture around you or because of something your parents did, or it's not actually coming from you. It's sort of coming from outside, and this can feel like it's very liberating because it said, you do you. You can be your own unique self. You can decide everything about yourself. Discover who you are sort of from the inside out.
Yeah.
I think it's actually really like painful and unraveling is the word that kind of comes to mind.
Yeah.
For a couple of reasons. One, because we humans we're just not designed to build our own identities from the ground up.
No.
We're designed to learn about who we are sort of in community with others and to have certain things that are kind of givens for us rather than a completely unlimited freedom to sort of self-determine in every possible way.
Mm.
And two, because actually, when I look into my heart, a lot of the things I see there are not good.
Yeah.
And I remember talking with a friend a few years ago she'd become a Christian, a few months earlier and had very much kind of grown up with this idea of everything must be, everything about me must be good. She had a mug which said, "Nobody's perfect, I'm nobody." Like just this. And she talked about the relief of discovering, oh no, I actually don't need to convince myself that every thought and feeling I have is by definition good.
Mm.
And recognizing that doesn't mean I kind of wallow in self-loathing and despair, because actually the one person who loves me so much that he came to die for me is also the one person who knows the absolute worst of me. So there's this deeply redemptive, reassuring kind of life-affirming truth at the heart of the Christian faith, which is that you and I are not these sort of fundamentally good people who, maybe occasionally do something wrong, but like really, if you looked into our hearts, you'd see the good, true, and the beautiful. We're actually sinners who needed Jesus to die for us.
Yeah.
But that he did die for us, and he died for us not sort of resentfully, but because he wants to live with us forever, and that we are now included in him. So it's a fundamentally different kind of understanding of what it means to be a human being, of how we interpret even our own thoughts and feelings, let alone kind of how other people act in the world. And it's a profoundly hopeful understanding of the world, because it says that love will conquer in the end, because love died to win the greatest battle ever fought.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I can find my identity in him. I don't need to define it all for myself. He is everything I will ever need, entirely sufficient for everything. He is perfect and complete. Wonderful. A great message. So let's just pause at this point for a brief word from our sponsor before we come back to think about Philemon and that issue of slavery. Well, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Lee Gatiss, and I'm joined today by Rebecca McLaughlin, author of the new Hodder Bible commentary on Colossians and Philemon. So this is a two-for-one commentary, so to speak. So we get Philemon as well as Colossians. One of the big issues in Philemon has to be slavery, since Paul is writing to Philemon about his slave, Onesimus. What's going on there, Rebecca? And why do we need to be sensitive to this issue right now, today?
You know, Paul's letter to Philemon is one of the shortest letters in the New Testament, and it is often kind of skipped over and neglected. People don't really know what to do with it. I feel like it's seldom preached. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's just in churches I seldom do I walk into church and hear, we're preaching Philemon this week. If you wanted to boil down the headline news of the letter, Paul's letter to Philemon, you could say Paul writes to send an escaped slave back to his master. And a lot of people hear that and they think, oh my goodness, if there was ever proof that the Bible affirms slavery, Philemon is it.
Yeah.
Until you read the letter. And here's the problem with that understanding of Paul's letter to Philemon, because Paul writes to Philemon. First, he writes not only to Philemon individually, but he actually writes to Philemon's sort of family and the church in his house. So it's a public letter. And as he describes who Onesimus is, so this guy who was legally Philemon's slave in the context of the Roman Empire, where it was fundamentally a slave society. I mean, there were millions of people who were legally slaves, and actually the category of slavery range from everything we might imagine about the sort of most oppressed and brutalized and exploited, incarnations of slavery that you could think of, on the one hand, to actually people who, to all intents and purposes, were living quite comfortable lives, often with higher status even than some of the kind of poorer people who are legally free. So it's a much kind of larger category than we know.
Yeah, so these are not sort of plantation workers as we imagine in 19th century deep South America. Slaves in the Roman Empire, in ancient Greece, could have been doctors, they could have been lawyers, they could have been all kinds of things, engineers, in any strata of society in that sense, but they would have been slaves to somebody else. And it wasn't a racial thing, was it? It was not just black slaves owned by white people. It was much more mixed and varied than that.
Yes, in fact, kind of almost amusingly is completely the wrong word. But there was a particular ethnic group, Scythians, who Paul at one point references, who were known for being slaves. Like they were often, because they'd been conquered by the Romans, they were often used as slaves, and they were also known for their especially white skin, which the Romans kind of thought was, the ideal was clearly kind of a Mediterranean, like somewhat brown. So there were, they felt like they were the sort of core Romans were the ideal, and the Scythians were sort of far too white, and very much fitted into the category of slave. So Paul sends Onesimus back. He uses, as he describes his relationship with Onesimus, he uses the most affectionate language that he uses of any individual other Christian. Paul writes an awful lot about love in his letters, and you hear him sort of expressing his love for certain individuals, and among his brothers and sisters. And here, Paul calls Onesimus his very heart, or kind of literally kind of his intestines, because in the Greek, they use the intestines kind of like we use the heart, as in like the bodily organ that
my very guts. He's my very guts.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Here. And Paul says to Philemon not only that he needs to receive Onesimus back and kind of let him off for the punishment that would have generally been expected for somebody who'd run away from their master in that culture, but that Philemon needs to receive Onesimus back as if he were receiving Paul himself. Mm-hmm. So there Paul does this complete inversion, because, Paul is Philemon's most respected mentor. He's an apostle. He's like, if anybody has the right to tell Philemon what to do, it's Paul. And Paul tells Philemon, you need to receive Onesimus back as a beloved brother, and like you would receive me. Roll out the red carpet for Onesimus. Which again completely upends the power structures and the hierarchies that would have been expected in this situation.
Totally.
And if we think about it, I mean, we could do, a 5-hour long episode on slavery in the Bible, which we clearly don't have time for. But
awesome, let's do it another time. That sounds great.
but if we think about how Jesus taught his disciples, famously he just told his disciples he was going to the cross, and they start arguing about which of them is most important. So embarrassing for the apostles. And Jesus says to them, listen, I know that that's what it's like among the Gentiles, that sort of those who are in authority kick down to those underneath them. And he says it's not to be like that with you. Instead, whoever wants to be first among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be great among you must be slave of all. Why? Because even Jesus, the Son of Man, did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And this is why Paul will often refer to himself as slave of Christ, because, and the other sort of first century Christian leaders often use that language too, and it feels a little jarring to us. It would have felt very jarring as well in the context that they were writing to. But
yes,
the fact is that Jesus is the master who came to die a slave's death to ransom us.
It's right there in the name Lord, isn't it? I mean, Lord is the name for a master, for a slave master. And if we call him Lord Jesus, we are kind of implicitly saying, I am his slave and he is my Lord, my master.
Yes. And if even this great master, the king of all the universe, who has the right to tell you and me what to do, if he came not to be served but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, how much more should we live like that? And so I suppose one way to put it is a sort of banner headline summary of what the New Testament says about slavery is that the New Testament doesn't abolish slavery by saying nobody's a slave. It actually abolishes slavery by saying everybody's a slave. Every follower of Jesus is in fact Jesus' slave, and our job is to serve one another. So it completely undermines the whole edifice of slavery, sort of puts some dynamite under the bridge and explodes it.
We have to be really sensitive with this issue today, don't we? Because of the conversations about slavery in the world today. I mean, there's just been a recent UN resolution calling on reparations from former slave colonies of the British Empire, for example. You've handled this really carefully in the commentary, but you are very conscious, aren't you, about those sensitivities around the issue today? I mean, you're in America, you have to be as well.
Yeah, well, also I'm a Christian, and so I have to be. Because the fact is that the reason that we know that, for example, slavery and segregation in the US was profoundly wrong is because of the Bible. The reason we know that the fact that the UK benefited massively financially from transporting enslaved Africans to the Americas, the reason we know that's wrong is actually because of Christianity. Prior to Christianity, nobody was arguing against slavery. Like really, it was a very much a Christian innovation, and the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade were conducted by people who, if we buy the idea that England, for example, was a kind of Christian country, or that America was a Christian country, they were perpetrated by cultures and countries who should have known better. In fact, I mean, slavery had already been formally declared sort of sinful by the church, like way before this. Yes. So. The reason that we need to be clear and not squeamish about recognizing the profoundly sinful history and the ways in which, tragically, all too many Christian leaders, supposedly Christian leaders, and even, perhaps in other respects, legitimately Christian and massively flawed in this area and sort of perpetuating sin in this area, leaders, is because it's against the teachings of the Bible. Like there was fundamentally riding roughshod over how the Bible talks about us human beings and how we're to relate to one another. I mean, when you look at some of the arguments that people made from the Bible to support race-based slavery in America, for instance, they are so absurd that it would be funny if it wasn't so tragic.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just...
Risible.
Risible is the word.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, you've been... you've kind of exceeded the brief in this commentary in that sense, because I asked all the commentators to be doctrinally aware and to deal with doctrinal issues as they come up in the texts, and to be globally sensitive and to read international scholars from places that you're not from or haven't lived. But you've gone one step beyond. You've given us a good kind of apologetic edge on this particular issue of slavery as well, in the way that you've talked about it, which sets the commentary apart and is wonderful. Rebecca, as you've worked closely through both of these letters to the Colossians and to Philemon, what's most struck you afresh or challenged you or excited you personally? Something new, something deeper that you'd never thought you'd seen before?
Yeah, so many things to say. As I mentioned, the fact that in Colossians, Paul is pointing us to an understanding of who Jesus is that is literally beyond our wildest dreams. Like beyond, it's like looking up at the night sky and trying to count the stars. I mean, you just can't do it. So I feel less like I kind of learned a completely new thing and more like I iterated and sort of reinforced in my own mind and heart some of the central truths of what it means to be a Christian, and in particular what it means to trust that I have died and my life is now hidden with Christ in God. Like that actually what happens here on this earth, it's not that it's unimportant, because as a slave of Christ, I have work to do, and so do you. But that actually there's nothing that can happen to me here and now that can take away from my eternal destiny, because I'm hidden in Christ. And when he comes back, I will appear with him in glory. And so, regardless of what we have or haven't achieved in our lives, regardless of what anybody else does or doesn't think of us, regardless of how loved or unloved we feel, regardless of whether we struggle with debilitating depression or whether we're sort of living our best lives in peace and happiness now, if we've trusted in Jesus, then when Christ, who is our life, appears, we also will appear with him in glory. And so it's just like reinforcing that in my own mind and heart, which as a follower of Jesus is something I kind of need to do every day, because part of Satan's mission for me is to sort of blow me off course from that and say, oh no, you need to mostly care about your own interests now, what other people think of you, whether people love you, or all the things that we kind of tell ourselves as we look inside and look to our own interests are the most important things, when actually we can have the freedom of knowing that we are already unimaginably loved and that our future is extraordinarily bright.
Beautifully put. So the Hodder Bible commentary on Colossians and Philemon will be out in all good bookshops from July 2026. As it says on the back of the book, in Colossians and Philemon, we see the mind-blowing supremacy of Christ, his stunning, sin-cancelling victory, and the unprecedented peace and unity it brings. Far from affirming slavery, as some imagine, these paired letters demonstrate the radical equality that flows from recognizing Jesus as the one true Lord. Situating these two letters in their biblical and historical context, Rebecca McLaughlin's commentary explores how Paul's two letters to the church in Colossae shape how we cling to Jesus as our spiritual head, and how we relate to one another, focusing our minds and hearts on his return. Rebecca, thank you for joining us on the Church Society podcast today.
Thank you, Lee, for joining me on the Confronting Christianity podcast.
You're very welcome.
You guys have been listening to the Confronting Christianity podcast in concert with the Church Society podcast. You can follow us on X or Instagram if you go near either of those things. You can leave a review on iTunes. You can subscribe for the weekly newsletter at confrontingchristianity.org. We've made a nice little change there. And until I speak into your headphones next week, my prayer is that you would reflect on the extraordinary beauty and overwhelming love of Jesus, who came to die for you.